I was bald, was in the middle of chemotherapy for my lymphoma, and I'm sitting in the audience. He says, "We sequence all of our patients." And I'm sitting in the audience going, "No, you don't." Because I've asked my oncologist 5 times to get my tissue sequenced, and it hasn't happened. And so I went up to the microphone and said, "I love your institution. I think it's a great institution. I'm sure what you said is exactly your intention and that you've said that. But I'm just going to tell you it's not happening at the front line because, here I am with my bald head from the chemotherapy, and I've asked my oncologist 5 times and it hasn't happened." But if you really want rapid change, which is what patients, if you want to bend the curve to what's possible, then it's going to be startups that'll do that, and it's going to be empowered patients.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast dedicated to helping patients and their caregivers advocate for a precision medicine approach to treatment, disease screening, and prevention. Today, I'm really honored and excited to have our guest, Brad Power, process innovation expert and co-founder of patient advocacy organizations. And I'm not quite sure, Brad, if they're actually patient advocacy organizations or companies that we should categorize another way, but you're doing some powerful work with the Cancer Hacker Lab and the Cancer Patient Lab. Brad, thanks for joining me on Genetics for Healthcare.
My pleasure, Rome.
So, Brad is one of those folks I consider in the work that we're doing here on the podcast and abroad, just bridging the gap between innovation and patient access to precision medicine. He is a warrior on the front lines. He's become, in my network, one of those folks that I reach out to for just kind of perspective on things, and we've connected over the years. But we met at a conference at Harvard Business School about 7 years ago.
Harvard Medical School.
Yeah. It was very much an industry think tank at the time, discussing ways to bring, precision medicine from bench research to bedside for patient care. And, many of those in attendance, including myself, I guess we can consider as being, futurist. We talk about the innovation in the present value to patients, even though a lot of what's talked about, patients can't access. And there was a leader from a prominent Boston Cancer Research Center talking about his institution, how they incorporate genetic insights from patient care from the very beginning, suggesting it's the standard and it's what makes them one of the best. And then you stepped up to the microphone to respond to him. Can you share what your condition was at the time, kind of what was your thinking in the moment, and what really motivated you to share your experience, not just with him, but with the entire room?
Yeah, so you have to picture like an amphitheater and with a couple of microphones in the aisles. This is like in Paper Chase, or something. So he made that statement, and I was being treated at his institution, and I was bald, was in the middle of chemotherapy for my lymphoma, and I'm sitting in the audience. He says, "We sequence all of our patients." And I'm sitting in the audience going, "No, you don't." Because I've asked my oncologist 5 times to get my tissue sequenced, and it hasn't happened. And so I went up to the microphone and said, "I love your institution. I think it's a great institution. I'm sure what you said is exactly your intention and that you've said that. But I'm just going to tell you it's not happening at the front line because, here I am with my bald head from the chemotherapy, and I've asked my oncologist 5 times and it hasn't happened." And just to sort of tell the rest of that story was people like yourself then I met half a dozen or 10 people saying, "Thank you for adding that dose of reality to this rah-rah convention of people that are promoting personalized medicine."
Yeah. Yeah. It was a moment for sure. Do you mind sharing for those listening what your diagnosis was?
Yeah, so I had follicular lymphoma, which is, I think, probably the most common form of lymphoma. There are like probably 100 types of lymphoma, which everyone I presume knows is one of the blood cancers. Um, and follicular is characterized by being responsive to treatment. There are a lot of treatment options, and also being effectively a chronic condition that people with it live a normal lifespan typically, but it doesn't. It responds to treatment and then it comes back, and typically in something like 3 to 5 years. And so that's what happened to me. So at that time, I got the chemotherapy. It knocked it down. I had no evidence of disease, and then it came back in about 4 years later. And I then went to a second line of treatment, chose a clinical trial of a innovative. It was a virus that had some antigens on it that were similar to the cancer cells to alert the immune system. And I had a incomplete response or a partial response to that, so I was kicked out of that trial. And then I had 5 options that my oncologist offered to me, and chose from among those CAR T, which is a engineered cell therapy that is an immunotherapy.
So I want to back this up for those who are out there who are not necessarily familiar with, lymphomas or the care for, cancer. But follicular lymphoma occurs in your white blood cells, a specific type of white blood cell called your B cells. And what happens is all cancer is characterized by is an uncontrollable growth of those cells, in this case, white blood cells, that eventually will form a mass or what's called a tumor in a person's lymph node. And it's found a number of different ways. As you just shared your treatment journey since then, the hallmark of the standard of care is a chemotherapy cocktail with a monoclonal antibody, which is a CD120 protein targeting drug. So it's a targeted agent for sure, not as selective as some of the others. And as you also mentioned, follicular lymphoma is usually not considered to be curable, but cancer treating physicians, hematologists in this case, view it as a chronic disease, which means that as long as you continue to respond to therapy, you can maintain a certain quality of life. And fortunately, as you mentioned, there are new innovations in the precision medicine space that are providing new drugs or target that target the immune system or various aspects of the cell replicating process. But one promising opportunity was CAR T therapy. Can you explain, what was CAR T therapy? How was it explained to you, and kind of what was the process?
Yeah, so CAR T, chimeric antigen receptor T cell. So it's basically when the immune system is working, it recognizes cancer cells as foreign, and it kills them. So for some reason, my lymphoma is breaking through that defense system. And so what's going on? Why is my immune system not recognizing and killing these cancer cells? The reason is because it's it's not seeing those antigens for one reason or another. And so what the immunotherapy does is it creates more of those antigens that are looking like the cancer cells, just like the COVID vaccine, which was made with mRNA and people may be acquainted with. It was the coronavirus, which meant it had a crown, it had a shape of antigens. And then the mRNA vaccine imitated that. And then the immune system went after the vaccine that you put in, and then also got the cancer cells, or in that case, the COVID cells, the virus. So it's the same kind of process. And so what they do is they take out your blood and they pull out your white blood cells. It's called a leukapheresis. And then they send those off to a lab, and they take those white blood cells, the T cells, and they engineer them to have, which they can do with genetic engineering. They engineer them to have the antigens that are the same that I have on my cancer cells, something called CD19, as you mentioned, CD20. And then they reinfuse them. So they infuse them like they put them in through back into my blood system. And then the immune system responds and kills the cancer cells because it recognizes the unique profile of those cancer cells. There's a side effect. So this is not a free lunch, just as with chemotherapy where you lose your hair and can feel kind of tired and so on. The excitement of the immune system can go overboard. And so you can get what's called a cytokine release syndrome or cytokine storm. And that's an over-inflammation response. Your immune system recognizes it's got something foreign in it and goes crazy. And that results in about 60% of the people that get the therapy being hospitalized, as I was. So I had a strong enough reaction. I was being treated outpatient, but because I'm very close to the place where I'm being treated in Boston. But I went into the emergency room and was hospitalized for 5 days while they monitored.
I didn't know that, but today you look strong, you sound strong. We spoke the other day, and your body seems to be responding. Is
Yeah.
that's still the case?
Yeah, it's sort of like you go through this valley of, it's like if you had a hip replacement, you go through the surgery and you're knocked out for a while, you go for physical therapy, and then you're back maybe better than before. So anyway, I'm pretty much back to being good. I'm a little immunocompromised, so I'm taking antibiotics, but otherwise I'm 100% healthy.
It's good to hear. When we first spoke, and you were on a podcast that I was doing at the time, the one thing that really stood out to me in talking to you is the perspective that you had on what happened. When we first spoke of your diagnosis, you said that your thought was, this is going to be something that will help me, which is incredibly empowering. Now, are you just like, everything in life is, half glass half full? Because, of my life's journey, I have formed the mindset that what happens to us in life has to happen to either make you the person that you were meant to be, or it comes to prepare you for a purpose that only you can fulfill. You talk about how you arrived at that mindset and how it led you into doing what you're doing today.
Yeah, I have just a kind of unique personality that's, whether it's an engineering mindset that I inherited from my father or a philosophical mindset that I developed from playing cards. I play bridge, and when you play bridge, you're dealt a hand, and you play the hand of the best you can. And so you don't get to choose what the cards are that you're dealt. All you can do is play the hand that you're dealt and do the best you can with it. So it's sort of in my mindset, in my DNA, to look at stuff that happens, and if I can't control it, if I get a scan and it says I have disease, whatever, I can't control that, but I can control my reaction to it. So that's a flavor of the Serenity Prayer, if you know it, which is to just sort of accept the things you can't control, and not stress or worry about them, and then do what you can with the things with the hand you're dealt. And I was dealt
kitchen growing up.
I was dealt cancer, and so you're dealt lemons, make lemonade. So I had an opportunity, and it was pretty much that session that you were talking about, where all these people said, "You have a voice. There's something you can do here." I felt it was like a calling. It was something was telling me that this is what my purpose was. This is what I should do, and it hit me at a time of life where it built on things that I was doing and could do, and so I sort of followed it and made the lemonade from the lemons I was dealt.
Yeah. So you started out doing what you called hackathons, even before, I guess, forming any company. What was the hackathon, and what was kind of the genesis of that idea?
Yeah. So I think even at that session that you and I were both at, they had a patient. You always have a patient, representative on stage to give the patient perspective. And I think it was at that session that Bryce Olson spoke. And Bryce was a very charismatic individual. He was a prostate cancer survivor. Um, he had been through multiple lines of therapy. He wore T-shirts that said "Sequence Me," and he had a group called SequenceMe.org. So he was quite a proponent of everyone getting their sequencing at a time, and this was again 6 or 7 years ago, when not everybody was aware of sequencing, and that could influence their cancer treatment. Um, I got to know him at that session. Got in touch with him. He lived in Portland, Oregon, and became friends. Whenever my wife's family's from Portland, we would go there a couple times a year. I'd see him. We'd have coffee or lunch or something. And he was quite an inspiring figure. He inspired a lot of people. And at a point, I was checking in with him around Christmas. This would have been around 2021, I think. And it was during the pandemic was underway. And he said, "Brad, I've hit a wall. I don't know what to do. I've run out of pathways to treat." And I said, "Well, we could run a hackathon for you," thinking that maybe some innovative person out there in the world would have ideas for him about what to do next. And he said, "Yeah, let's do it." So then I had to figure out what to do. What's a hackathon and how do I do it? And I went to some friends. I went to some people who are now my friends. Pete Kane in particular, who had run some hackathons for some patients, and he sort of gave me how he had done it, and we designed sort of a weekly meeting, all virtual, using Zoom, where he was, because he was a key opinion leader, he had about 25 or 50 people that were advisors that he would want in that conversation, and I had about 25 or 50 people that I invited, and so we had 50 to 100 people that would participate, on and off in these calls, from leading experts in prostate cancer research to patient advocates to fellow patients and so on. And each session we would walk through what his issue was at the moment. We try and help him sort through what decision he should make.
Did you find it difficult to locate those advocates or patients who were out there looking for additional information? Like what was, did it kind of, ramp up immediately, or was this more than
As I said, he had a social network that he brought with him, and I had a social network that I brought with me. As you know, I'm quite a social networker, and at that point, I had been at this sort of cancer, getting to know people, coming up the learning curve myself, and getting to know leaders of various types for a couple years. And so I was, between the two of us, we were able to just invite those people, and then they could invite others.
Now, that started, I envision this in hospital systems and cancer centers when, physicians encounter tough patients that may have run out of options. They have what's called a tumor board, right? And they come together and talk about the specific case, and they offer different perspectives. But I'm impressed that what came out of that was the Cancer Hacker Lab. Tell us about Cancer Hacker Lab and kind of how you came from hackathons to this company.
Yeah. So it was actually the Cancer Patient Lab. It's an easy distinction to get confused. So the Cancer Patient Lab is the nonprofit learning community that came out of it. So the criticism that I received from some people about running the hackathons is, this is great for Bryce, and we ran a couple of others. It's great for the individual, but it doesn't really scale. So you're helping one person, but there's a mass of people who aren't getting helped. And so the idea was, let's do this on an open basis so that we collectively learn continuously, and everybody raises their level of understanding and their ability to participate in their medical care and get answers to the questions they have. And cancer is not an event. It's a lifetime. It's the issues that people face and the questions they have come up over time as their treatment works or doesn't work, et cetera. So it's helpful to have an ongoing platform where people can go interrogate the information there or ask people for advice. And so that's what we set up. So the cancer patient lab is like a multi-person hackathon, if you will, where there's a crowdsource of information that allows people to, again, to come up the learning curve and to more actively participate in their care decisions. We like to say that engaged patients get better outcomes. So we're trying to role model patients and caregivers getting engaged in their care decisions and getting the learning that they need in order to be able to do that. And our other tagline is to be co-pilots with their medical team.
You and I have been asking these same questions regarding the growth of precision medicine for a long time. We're looking for the tipping point, and the persistent question that we have is, where's the market disruption going to come from, right? To drive NGS testing to be done at economies of scale, right? They're easily accessible. And when we spoke years ago, we both believed that this disruption is going to come from the patient community in driving demand for it. And that's what I see the cancer patient lab, doing. Is that the idea?
It is, exactly. So again, I'm a management thought leader by background, and written a whole bunch of articles for the Harvard Business Review. And there's work done by a man named Clayton Christensen. He was a friend of mine, and he wrote about disruption. So how do you disrupt an established industry that's very I'll just say, I could come up with a nicer way of saying it, but fat, dumb, and happy. In other words, they're comfortable with the status quo. And so how are you going to get an industry that's happy with a status quo going to change? And the examples, whether it's Airbnb or Uber or what have you, disruption comes from the outside by startups who are working with empowered customers. And so there are two ways. If you believe, as I do, and you do, that the way we do healthcare today needs to be disrupted, that the adoption of innovation is too slow, and there are a lot of things that are broken in the system that need to be fixed, then the approach that's going to do that on a rapid basis. Now, the incumbents in the system, whether they're pharma, payers, providers, they are going to improve slowly and incrementally, and unusually slowly in healthcare because it's a very conservative industry. Which depends on the randomized clinical trial for improvement. But if you really want rapid change, which is what patients, if you want to bend the curve to what's possible, whether it's precision medicine, you said DNA sequencing, I would add RNA sequencing, proteomics, liquid biopsies, functional testing, and on and on and on. There are a whole lot of diagnostics that could help inform patients, but the adoption of those diagnostic technologies is glacially slow because of the characteristics of the system. Then it's going to be startups that'll do that, and it's going to be empowered patients. So the cancer patient lab is designed to get those patients empowered, to get them to get better outcomes, to showcase when they get better outcomes, and to show the world that if you get engaged and you get access to these more cutting edge diagnostics, that you're going to get better outcomes. The other side of this, and that's the Cancer Hacker Lab, is an accelerator for startups. So I'm trying to do two things: is to encourage disruption, help the patients get up to speed, so they, lobby for either with their caregiver, their doctors, or with the system generally, to say, I want access to these novel diagnostics. At the same time, supporting the startups that are offering those new services.
So you've got a massive effort. So it's bottom up from educating the consumer patients to demand services, but it's also top down to help inform innovation in how to strategically, launch or approach the market with something that can scale or that is, more easily adoptable in the marketplace. Is that correct?
Yeah, the characterization I would use is outside in. We're really doing it as outsiders to the medical system, to then come to the medical system and demand or ask for or request the things that we think are best for us, and thereby reform the system by coming with what we think are the best treatments for us.
So when you put on your process reengineering hat and you look at the current system and the way that products these many different services, as you mentioned, we talk about precision medicine. Precision medicine is more than just gene sequencing. It's more than just oncology, even though cancer care is where it's used most robustly. But when you put that process reengineering hat on, where do things go wrong in the process of either drug or product delivery from innovation to patient access?
So, as a process, as you say, as a process consultant, as a process reengineer, I'm looking at what is the process that we're trying to reengineer? Who's the customer, and what's the process? And basically, I would submit to you that there are two processes that we're talking about: testing decision making and treatment decision making. And those are currently embedded in the way that people get the answer to those questions. Is they, in the current process, they go to their doctor, and their doctor tells them what tests they should get and tells them what treatments they should get. And what we're trying to do is expand that in the same way that you would get a second opinion on both of those decisions. You would also potentially get a crowd opinion on both of those decisions, right? And so it is not about drug discovery. The process of drug discovery is outside of scope for me and for us. That is, drug discovery is the beneficiary as a pharmaceutical company or an academic researcher who's creating a drug, a new therapy that's going to make the world better. It's going to, and that's wonderful that is being done, but that's not any of what we're trying to be involved in. That is, that process needs to be re-engineered. We could go into how that could be re-engineered, but that's not what we're about. What we're about is those things create the universe, the menu of options of possible treatments that patients could get access to, and that they're confronted with a question: which of those should I get access to, given my unique situation, personalized to me, with my unique profile, my genomic profile, my medical history, et cetera? Which of those possible options out there is best for me? And as you will know, one of the biggest challenges is that with all of these new diagnostic tests, often those best test for me, or excuse me, best treatment for me is what is called off-label, meaning there was not a randomized clinical trial that was done for my profile that is best for that drug. So let's say I have lymphoma, I do a functional test, and lo and behold, there's an asthma drug that kills my cancer. And now I want to use that asthma drug to treat my cancer. That's an off-label use. The drug is safe. It's been proven to be effective for asthma, but nobody's ever applied it in my case. And so that's the territory we get into, which is a question of access to off-label or other types of treatments that are not within that standard of care in the NCCN guidelines.
Yeah, that's it. Kind of when you were talking about the two components of first testing, and one of the rate limiting factors of adoption has been many times the tests are not reimbursed, and the therapy on the other side of that. And there's just seems to be no consensus within the industry because, many times there is a $3,000, genetic or genomic test that can unlock access to a $350,000, therapy. And many times the therapy can be paid for, but they will not consistently pay for that diagnostic. Do you think in a process reengineering standpoint, tools like AI or clinical decision support, natural language programming that can, pick up these elements out of a patient chart can have the ability to streamline access or at least to accelerate access in the future?
Yeah. So there are at least two answers, maybe more, to that dilemma. And I'm working on a startup that would address some of this, the access question, access to the test. One is why do we need reimbursement? Like the U.S. is uniquely in the world and I guess other countries that have national health systems. You only get the test that is in the standard protocols, that is in that either that reimbursement by insurance companies in the U.S. or the national health system. But there are countries uh, in the Middle East, in India and China, where there's a retail culture about healthcare. You pay. I was wandering in a small village in Sikkim, and there was I stumbled onto a shop. I think there was a dirt road, and they were doing cardiac surgeries. It's like, okay, so you could walk in and get a heart surgery. It's like in other countries and other places, there's a culture. So if you said it's $3,000 for the test, then the consumer would look at it and say, is it worth $3,000 to get that test? And you might say yes. Um, is that test $3,000 because that's the actual cost basis of it, or is it reflecting some other things in it? If, and I'm sure you know about this, if this were a companion diagnostic, so a companion diagnostic is a test that tells you that you will be a likely responder to a particular drug. Would the pharmaceutical company build that in because it's going to increase the positive response to their pharmaceutical from 20% to 80%? Would they just embed that cost of that diagnostic in the pharmaceutical? Yeah, they probably would. If so, our vision is that the cost is something that patients could handle, and maybe they're in India or China, and they're high net worth people, at least initially. It's called the Tesla strategy, where you build the Roadster first, and then you eventually, it's just $100,000, and you eventually build the $30,000 version. You start with high net worth people who can afford to pay $3,000 for the test. You show that it works better, and then eventually everybody migrates to that. Volume increases and prices come down. Our idea is to get the decision making on navigation and diagnostics patients paying for out of pocket, so that they are then in control and then shop for their actual treatment, their physical treatment. So if you're in a metropolitan area and you have a variety of health institutions that could deliver the treatment that you want, you go to the one that you choose. And so that shifts the power, which is currently all decisions basically revolve around the provider, whether you get a test, what treatment you get. And this shifts it to the patient deciding, which is the dynamic in every other industry. And so we're talking disruption, but in every other industry, the consumer, whether you're buying a car, whether you're buying a house, you decide what you're going to pay, and there's a market for that. That does not happen in healthcare for the very reason you're talking about the involvement of reimbursement through payers and guidelines and all the systems that are built into the current system.
Brad, what you talk about, and hopefully this doesn't sound, crazy. What you talk about sounds like healthcare as opposed to sick care. The reason why, and I've heard this several times, that in the US, we don't oftentimes practice healthcare. We practice sick care, which means when you are diagnosed or you have an ailment, you come to a healthcare provider and they treat you based on certainly standards of care, standard practices, but sometimes even more so what they can be paid for, because there could be multiple standards, but how do they choose, right? Do you think from a process reengineering point, it's even possible to go from sick care to health care, with screening and how genetics plays a role in identifying, risk for payers?
Yeah, I have seen. So I've mentioned I have an accelerator. We're working with a number of startups. Suppose you have a technology that's a new diagnostic technology that can tell you about the immune system, which is one of the companies that is there, or could do functional testing. You could target it at helping patients and caregivers make better decisions. But because of the incentives and patients don't pay, you take your technology and you sell it to pharmaceutical companies to help them discover drug targets, to help them in their clinical trials. You make it a companion diagnostic, etc. So the incentives that are built into our current system cause startups to gravitate towards applications that they can get funded by pharma, and not in terms of helping the decisions that I was talking about, testing and treatment decisions. Even though you can take something like predicting whether someone will respond to a drug. And that could be great for patients. It could be great for providers. It could be great for pharma. But if you have that technology, you're going to take it to pharma. And so it's going to then have built in that bias. Are they going to make that companion diagnostic available all the time? There's a horror story which I heard where a pharmaceutical company got rid of the companion diagnostic because instead of selling their drug to 40% of people that would respond, they can sell it to 100% of people. So you can see where the incentives would go. That's, that story, I think is true, but, whether it's true or not, it shows where the incentives would lead you. So how could we get to healthcare? So some of this, I've seen a few startups that interestingly have looked to life insurance for their business model, because a life insurance company is interested in the long-term health of the individual. And if you can extend their life for 3 years, that's a good thing for the life insurance company. So those incentives are aligned. The incentives can also be aligned with employers who might want their employees to be healthy. It's obviously aligned with consumers. The problem slightly with consumers is that consumers are not maybe as good at taking care of themselves as they should be. And there's an interesting wrinkle there with AI, is that an AI agent working on your behalf might be better at taking care of you than you are of yourself.
Oh, you just spit out 5 minutes of gold there for any entrepreneurs or investors. So many business ideas that you just dropped there. So great stuff, Brad. So if there are, patients who go to their doctor and they find themselves seemingly in the same situation that you were in, where they were asking for a genetic or a genomic test. And I tell you, I talk to, patients, and we share these stories for these reasons, because we want people to be aware and be empowered to have these conversations and to have their voice in their decisions for care. I talked to a young lady who was a breast cancer, survivor. She had an aunt that was a breast cancer survivor, and asked that doctor, don't know what the specialty was, about genetic testing, and the doctor said, well, you don't need that. I'm not going to use that. Well, it's not that she couldn't benefit from the test. It's not that the information would not have been useful for her or her family members. It's that doctor wasn't going to use it. So what do you say? How should patients and their family members respond when they have a clinician who's not supportive of ordering these tests?
Yeah. So just quickly to reinforce with my own stories, a couple of stories. The reason that my tissue had not been sequenced at the institution where I was, after asking my oncologist 5 times, was because it wasn't going to be relevant to my treatment decision. I had already made the treatment decision I was going to get chemotherapy, so there's no time sensitivity to it. He was humoring me. It's like, go knock yourself out. It's useful longitudinally to have a baseline of knowing what my genomic profile is for future decisions, but it's not relevant today and now. And I think that gets at the key issue that if you were a patient, you'd want to know, is like, particularly in my case, where you have as we've described, a disease that's going to be with me for a long time, and I'm going to get multiple shots on goal at treating it. Having a longitudinal view with multiple snapshots is a good thing. But if you went to your doctor and said, or your payer and said, can you justify giving me this test today? They might say no, because there's no decision to be made today. But isn't it nice to have all of those snapshots over time? And the most important technology today is probably liquid biopsies, so a blood draw. And you can get blood draws as often as you're willing to go in and have them take some blood out of you. You get one every week. And you could get them to do as I just did, not only your DNA sequencing and your DNA profile, but also your RNA profile. This can be done today with a liquid biopsy. So isn't that useful to have that? So I went to an advisor, Tony Magliacco at Protein Biodiagnostics. And I said, Tony, I'm going to be getting CAR T. What test should I get? And he said, you should get this liquid trace DNA RNA liquid biopsy before and after to see how it transforms. And you should get a Natera one to monitor your response to the therapy. I went to my doctor and I said, would you support me on this? And he said, yeah, I'll authorize it. And he said, and this is an oncologist that I love, and he's at the top academic research medical institution in Boston. And he said, if I had an RNA test report, I wouldn't know what to do with it. So this is another factor. Now, I said, that's fine because my friend Tony will interpret it. But this is another factor in terms of the adoption. Let's say he left medical school 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah. RNA sequencing is coming on. We're learning how to interpret it, but it's not become standard enough that we all know how to interpret it, and that there are protocols or guidelines for what to do with RNA sequencing. So is it better for me to get that? It sure is. But the medical system hasn't caught up for supporting that and reimbursing that and having that be part of the guidelines. And for me getting it, my doctor was nice. He humored me. I got it. I now have that point. But this is, I'm highlighting a difference between what I want as a patient and what the system is prepared to do.
Very good information. And just to recall a couple of things. First of all, thank goodness you had the relationship with your doctor to ask, and he told you the truth that, I wouldn't know how to use it. There's a lot of patients out there that may ask, and these doctors don't know, but they won't tell you that they don't know. They'll say, well, it's not useful. It's no, peer-reviewed studies, and a patient, what does that mean? Right. So they might have a tendency, not saying they do, but I know that it's been done before, to talk over the patient's head, and the patient doesn't feel like a partner in their care. And secondly, they talk about the cost of these tests. And this is not a trivial thing because, certainly these tests can cost, into thousands of dollars. But typically, and again, not medical advice, this is just me being a part of the industry. As we know, these central labs that market these tests oftentimes will work with the patient, or if the patient has no ability to pay or insurance won't pay for a given situation, that company will work with you to pay for that test. And they typically don't send patients to collections. And that's the thing that always kind of miffed me about clinicians who were hesitant to order, citing the cost, because it's not the central labs that are sending these patients into bankruptcy. It's your hospital system. Okay, so to end this, I always like to give patients, whether they are dealing with the same condition as you may be or not, but what are 3 questions patients can ask their care team, not just their oncologist or surgeon, but what are 3 questions they can have, at the ready to ask their care team to help them advocate for a precision medicine approach to their care?
We are working on we call it a patient needs assessment, which is going to be a series of questions that patients can use to articulate their preferences, priorities, values, beliefs. A classic one is length of life versus quality of life. So do you want to have a very toxic treatment that will leave you in a very bad quality of life, but it'll allow you to live another 6 months, or not? And where are you on that spectrum? So I think there are a series of questions which, stay tuned. We'll have ready in a matter of a month or so, I think, that will help patients articulate their point of view to your question on a variety of topics.
Absolutely.
Given my biases, I'm all about thinking that people need more information. So if you're going to personalize care, you need data. And if you're going to get data, you need diagnostics. So maxing out on diagnostics is one of my pet beliefs. And so whether it's more liquid biopsies of different types, whether it's getting your tissue sequenced. It's always better to have more data, more information. And so that's something that I think patients should be asking their doctor, which is, are there any other tests that I could or should get that would help guide my care or identify other treatment options? When it comes to that decision or treatment decisions, again, I'm focusing on testing and treatment decisions, asking your doctor if you can get a second opinion. Now, this, as you know, gets into a whole emotional, potentially, or political thing. Are you basically saying to your doctor that you don't trust them, you don't respect them, and that you need another opinion because you don't honor them? So there's just some like hesitancy that most people would have in asking for that. But it just makes sense that if you're going to be making one of the most important decisions in your life, that you would want more input to it. And a second opinion is good, and a third and a fourth and a fifth and a crowd is even better. So again, maxing out on additional perspectives on the decision that you're facing. And they can be not only from experts, but from basically all walks of life. I come to this with no medical background, no biology background, and yet you're making trade-off decisions. And trade-off decisions are something that I do understand. Like I was suggesting, quality of life versus length of life, whether it's cost, cost versus benefit. Whether you want to have therapies that might be a home run for you, have a path to being curative versus something that's tried and true and is reliable, but has serious side effects. Those are all trade-off decisions that are part of this process.
Yeah. Incredible stuff. And for those of you who would want to access that frequently asked questions list, you can revisit this page where the episode will be found. We could place a link to it for easy access. But obviously, you can also follow Brad Power. Brad, do you have any social media handles, whether it's Twitter, or it'll forever be Twitter, whatever. I'm just not going there. It's Twitter, LinkedIn. Where's the best place for people to connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn would be a good place. I think I'm easily discoverable there. And then Cancer Patient Lab is cancerpatientlab.org, and Cancer Hacker Lab is cancerhackerlab.com.
Awesome. Brad Power, I always say process re-engineering expert. I don't even know if that's a thing, Brad.
It is.
Okay. So tell me, it's got to be very gratifying what you're doing for patients. I go back to the mindset thing. This is something that's meant to help me. Did you see this coming? Did you even have any forethought that it could be this to companies and dozens, if not hundreds, of patients that you guys are reaching?
I think when people are lucky, I've had a very fortunate life. I call myself blissfully ignorant. I've been very lucky, and occasionally in your life, you get to a point, Rome, I know you're going through a transition right now. You get to a point and you say, my whole life has been spent preparing me for this moment. And it happens that I ran multi-client research programs for re-engineering czars, as they were called back in the day. So I know how to run a community that's trying to learn collectively and raise everybody's learning level, and to call on thought leaders and to have them present whatever. So I know how to do that. So it was a natural thing for me to fall into because I had that background. I had also written 80 articles for the Harvard Business Review. So when it came to writing up the minutes or the notes or the articles that came out of each of the webinars that we were hosting, that's a natural for me as well. So it's just kind of, even without thinking about it, it was easy and natural for me to sort of evolve to the sorts of things that we're doing. And I had been involved with the understanding innovation and how innovation by large organizations is slow and incremental, and innovation by startups is how we actually achieve disruption. I was acquainted with that work as well, which is really useful in helping the startups that I've been working within the accelerator.
My whole life has prepared me for this time, this moment. Brad, if I had an organ, I would have, you'd have thought you was a Black Baptist church. I would start playing right there. Brad Power, thanks for being a guest on Genetics for Healthcare.
Thank you, Rome.